Thank you. Mark McKenna is an exemplary keynote speaker for this conference. His work, great diversity, span, depth and reflectiveness of his writing goes to the core of the ways in which we might think about the scales of history and the multiple ways in which we can understand that term, the scales of history. There are, for example, questions of perspective and relativity, from thinking about Mark's biography of Manning Clark's grand vision of the place of the Australian experience in the grand story of human questioning, through to the complexities of that particular personality, Clark's ego, conceits, deceits, compassion and generosity, and the interdependency between those extremes, the grand vision, the complex personality. Through to those scales that must fall away, the accretions of time's disservice to time, before we can begin to see and work with the past. In responding to the depth of reflection prompted by his recent quarterly essay, Moment of Truth, Mark characterised the ways in which we need to see the Australian frontier in terms, perhaps, of some of those scales falling away. I'm quoting Mark, not only as a war zone, but as a murky terrain of curiosity, cooperation, adaptation, human drama and cultural exchange that made Australia what it is today. Nothing in this story is two-sided or one-dimensional. Both senses of scale are present in that council, and all the ways in which we might think about the scale of history, particularly as it relates to that of this nation. Mark begins his most recent book, From the Edge, Australia's Lost History, with the image of the telescope Cook and Banks used on board the Endeavour to assess the Gwagal people ashore when they entered Botany Bay. The telescope as the instrument which allows us to see both in fine detail what is in the frame, at the same time as it disconnects that detail from its surroundings and cuts off peripheral vision. From the Edge eloquently teases out that tension, working from areas that are peripheral to our idea of Australia, but which are vital to recovering our sense of the place and its complex history. That book, as Mark says, also seeks to slow down the pace of experiencing and understanding that history. Not at the scale of the broad synthetic view of Google Earth, but at the scale of the walking pace, to walk the country, to appreciate, as Mark phrases it in one passage, that for every step that broke down the chasm of cultural difference, there was a countervailing push to remind both sides of the enormity of the divide between peoples. Scale in perspective, scale in time, scale in relationship. In From the Edge, Mark foreshadowed another book, expanding on this theme, and perhaps this afternoon, in moving from the beaches of the New South Wales south coast, Cooktown, Port Essington and the Pilbara coast, as they figured in From the Edge, to the ostensible centre of the Australian nation. That Australian nation about which Mark also cares deeply, that we should become a nation. In this afternoon's lecture, perhaps we have a sense of what that next book will offer in continuing to challenge us to reflect on those issues of scale. Professor Mark McKenna of the School of History, the University of Sydney, has published extensively in Australian history, including books which have won many prizes: Prime Ministers, Premiers and literary prizes, the Nettie Palmer, Ernest Scott and Douglas Stewart Prize, a Walkley Award, the AHA's own Hancock Prize. This list is indicative, it is far from exhaustive, and it reflects the wealth of his contribution to our discipline. It is my honour to introduce this afternoon's keynote address, The Spiritual Heart of the Commonwealth, Canberra and the House on the Hill, and to welcome Professor Mark McKenna to deliver it.
Thanks, Nick, for that very generous introduction. And thanks, Caroline and the National Archives, for sponsoring this lecture. Thank you very much. Also, my thanks to Sam Furphy and the organising committee of the AHA for inviting me to give this lecture. It's a great privilege to be able to give this lecture. And I guess, given the nature of my next book, which I'll explain, and the conference being in Canberra, there was only one choice really, but to make Canberra and Parliament House the subject of my lecture today. So, into the Lion's Den, Canberra and Canberra. In Coal Light, the final novel in Frank Morehouse's Edith trilogy, his heroine, Edith Campbell Berry, returns to Australia in the early 1950s to live here in Canberra, where she soon becomes involved in the planning and development of the unfinished national capital. Here, Edith discovers that it's possible to experience the privileges and discomforts of three modes of living in one place: the capital, the rural life, and exile. She moves into her new home in Arthur Circle, not far from Manuka, and she gazes out the front gable window for the first time. "What do you see?" her husband Ambrose asks her blankly. "Trees," Edith replies, "and an empty street. We're about as far away from the centre of the modern world as you can get without living in a desert." Morehouse captures the feeling of post-war Canberra acutely. There was something undeniably perplexing and unsettling about the place. Canberra was an idea, an act of imagination and will, still to be realised. It was both there and not there. Edith's bewilderment reflected many of the impressions of Canberra offered by historians and writers when I was writing Manning Clark's biography. Like Manning and Dymphna Clark, many of them had come to Canberra in the late 40s and 1950s to build new lives and careers and the national capital itself. Author Rosemary Brissenden's friends tried to dissuade her from moving from Melbourne. "You're mad," they told her. "You're taking yourself into exile," that word again. Like many reluctant victims, Brissenden eventually succumbed. Canberra in late summer, she recalled, when she arrived, and before long the autumn came, the Molongo River was still there, and I remember the paddocks and farms out the back of the ANU. I completely fell in love with the place. Others were frustrated by the obvious smallness of things. A place where it was impossible to get a meal or even a decent cup of coffee beyond Manuka. And even there, bacon and eggs was only served until 6 p.m, after which everyone retired to their bungalows in the paddock where all entertainment occurred. Like Edith Campbell Berry, historian Jessie Searle felt that she'd moved away from the centre of things. It seemed that everyone in post-war Canberra was camping out. At night, standing out the front of his family house in O'Connor, the biographer and literary scholar Axel Clark remembered as a young child seeing the distant lights of physicist Mark Oliphant's house built on a hill, he said, out in the scrub beyond O'Connor. Oliphant's house, Axel recalled, was then the final beacon for Canberra. In his recent literary history of Western Australians' wheat belt, like nothing on this earth, Tony Hughes explores the founding of the wheat belt as a psychic phenomenon. He tries to understand what the wheat belt felt like for the writers who lived there and wrote about their experience. Like the wheat belt, Canberra's fabricated landscape has infiltrated the lives of its residents in a unique way, eliciting its own history of psychological and emotional responses. One that perhaps has more in common with Washington, the city that partly influenced its design, than it does with either Sydney or Melbourne. From the moment Canberra was founded in 1913, the city's residents and visitors have struggled to reconcile a familiar litany of contradictions and absences. The first of these, I think, is undoubtedly emptiness, or what Romaldo Jurgala, architect of Parliament House, admiringly described as Canberra's generosity of space. You're laughing. Okay. Fine. You weren't meant to laugh at that, but fine. Which he thought was like no other city in the world. No, he wasn't being ironic. Within the city's cavernous spaces, which Walter Burley Griffin had actually imagined longingly as quiet zones, it was possible, Jergler felt, to find silence and stillness. At the same time, he knew that it was precisely that juxtaposition of the generosity of space and urban existence that gave Canberra its peculiar sense of unreality. From the air, this city appears more like a vast constellation of discrete suburbs than a capital city. Arterial roads cut through sparsely treed hills and paddocks burnt straw brown by harsh sunlight. Beyond, spreading in clusters, constellations of suburbs claw their way across the surface below. Bushland envelops this city. Sometimes I think it threatens to engulf it. At least it seems so from the air. The geographical area of the city spans around 40 kilometres from north to south and 25 kilometres from east to west, a spread actually comparable to that of Greater London. Yet the population here is a mere 400,000. As Hugh Stretton quipped decades ago, Canberra has room for all the mess it wants, anytime it wants it. So much of the city's strangeness emanates from its invented nature. This crisp, manicured sense of order leaves many visitors longing for more visual chaos, perhaps, as if Canberra's tidiness and formality somehow precludes a more spontaneous urban life. The city's necessary display of monuments, Anzac Parade's increasingly crowded trail of war memorials, the forgotten towers of granite and bronze built in memory of King George V, or the lonely jet fountain that shoots an arrow of water above Lake Burley Griffin, constructed incidentally as part of a memorial to James Cook's arrival at Botany Bay in 1770, can easily leave you, as James Warden felt in 1995, with semiotic fatigue. The stage is so obviously set. Every street name, every building, every roundabout is an emissary of national purpose. In so many ways, Canberra's orchestrated reality jars with the nation's idea of itself as intuitively formed and non-bureaucratic, a nation that has never found its deepest expressions of national communion in foundational political narratives or political speech, and rarely, for that matter, in political figures. As Nicholas Brown concludes in his recent history of Canberra, the city remains haunted by its long-standing fear that it's not authentically Australian. And to that fear we can add Prince Philip's typically blunt assessment in 1962, he's always good for those assessments, that Australia's capital is a city without a soul. Familiar refrain. Anxieties surrounding Canberra's sterility, undoubtedly one of the most common stereotypes of the city, has been present from its inception. In December 1927, when Prime Minister Stanley Bruce opened Canberra's Civic Centre, he didn't hide his displeasure. "I dislike this name, and I think it's wrong," he told the crowd gathered for the occasion. "In the name Civic, there is nothing characteristic of our country, and we must find a better and new name. In declaring this place open," this is a masterly idea, "I decline to use the term Civic Centre." So, Bruce's discomfort betrayed the challenge that Canberra's always faced: to overcome the city's artificiality, to find a way to make it gel rather than jar with the rest of the country, to make it not only the capital of the nation, but perhaps also its emotional centre. And in that way, Canberra's task has been not only legislative and bureaucratic, it's also been existential, and continues to be, perhaps. All of us, regardless of whether we've set foot in Canberra, are entangled with this place. In the vernacular, we know Canberra has become a byword for our collective disenchantment with politics. But no matter how deep that malaise, Canberra remains the one place created explicitly to give expression to our national aspirations. While it's possible to live in Hobart and dismiss Brisbane, or reside in Perth and disregard Sydney, none of us, no matter where we live in Australia, can ignore Canberra. Not entirely. Many of us might try. The ideal of federation demands that we have a relationship with the city. For it's here, like nowhere else, that Australia's national identity and democracy is given shape and form, planned, named, constructed, monumentalised, legislated and brought to life in myriad acts of political speech. Canberra, for better or worse, is where the official institutional narrative of who we are is spun. So this year, on the occasion of Parliament House's 30th anniversary, it seems an opportune moment to reassess Canberra's claims for centrality, both as the heart of federal democracy and of the nation itself. How successful has Canberra been, and the Parliament, in winning a place for itself in the national imagination? And exactly what kind of place has it won? The centre of a national community, or one far removed from the idealism that marked this city's conception and the crowning of Capitol Hill with Parliament House in 1988? And finally, how has the design and architecture of Parliament House reflected and influenced the fabric of our federal democracy? In 1958, the freshly minted National Capital Development Commission, established 1 year earlier under the Menzies government, imagined Canberra's parliamentary triangle as, quote, the heart not only of Canberra but of the whole Commonwealth. At that time, the Commission supported Griffin's original plan for Capitol Hill, which was the site of a symbolic ceremonial building or a series of pavilions, each dedicated to some particular aspect of Australian culture. And that building would symbolise Australian sentiment, achievement and ideals, and stand as the sentimental and spiritual head, in Griffin's eyes, if not the actual working mechanism of federation. So it wasn't in Griffin's conception to be the site for Parliament House. Now, although Griffin's idea was finally abandoned by the 1970s, by the time the brief for the new Parliament House was written at the end of that decade, it was made abundantly clear to the architects entering the international competition that Capitol Hill, as the city's most prominent landform, standing at the apex of the parliamentary triangle, must be home to, quote, a building that would become the physical and spiritual centre of the national capital and of the nation. 3 decades after these dreams of Parliament House becoming a spiritual centre of the capital and nation were first articulated, their purchase today, I think, seems tenuous at best. For Brendan Nelson, Director of the Australian War Memorial, the spiritual centre of the nation is not Parliament House, but the Australian War Memorial. Nelson fervently believes that the temple that crowns Anzac Parade, its exhibitions partly sponsored, as we know, by arms manufacturers, represents the soul of the nation. The Australian War Memorial and Federal Parliament, which appropriately face one another at opposing ends of Canberra's axis, occupy in many ways polar positions in the national imagination, one sacred and revered, and one, especially of late, fallen and reviled. More than a century since Griffin dreamt of a city that would reflect the bold, characteristic vision of Australian democracy, Canberra and the Federal Parliament's ambition to be seen as the spiritual centre of the Commonwealth in the 50s has been impeded not only by the failure of political leadership, but also, I think, by the rise of competing centres throughout the 20th century. As I hope to explore in my next book, it's possible to see Canberra, Uluru and the tiny arc of Pebble Beach at Anzac Cove on the Gallipoli Peninsula as rival centres of the national imagination. Today, the pilgrimage to Uluru and Central Australia, alongside the pilgrimage to Anzac Cove, is a rite of passage for many Australians. Yet different as they are, the deep emotions, mystery, sacredness associated with the pilgrimage to Uluru and Anzac Cove stands in stark contrast to Canberra's pull on the national imaginary. But placing Canberra, I hope, next to Uluru and Anzac Cove will allow us, I think, to see precisely what kind of centre each place has actually become. Their paths cross in surprising ways. I thought I knew my country, reflected geologist Cecil Madigan after he returned from Central Australia in 1943. It was impossible to truly know Australia, Madigan believed, without first visiting what he called its vast, lonely inland region. Yet the attempt to create the national capital here also involved a confrontation with the phantom of Madigan's empty centre and the familiar tropes applied to so many other regions beyond the urban coastal fringe: vastness, emptiness, distance, isolation, remoteness, the middle of nowhere syndrome. In other words, to make the geographically widespread communities of an island continent cohere into a nation with Canberra as their centre, a city that eerily came to have its own empty centre, one comprised not of red desert sands, but clipped green lawns, and one that Canberra's National Capital Development Commission, from the moment it was founded, became obsessed with filling in, and that task is still underway. Canberra's long been unnerved by its open spaces and fear of being centreless. In 1927, a West Australian journalist stood on top of Capitol Hill under the branches of an ancient red gum, looking down on the scene that accompanied the opening of what we now call Old Parliament House, which he could see, he wrote, lying beneath me like a huge squat wedding cake. The Parliament was marooned, he lamented, amidst the vast distances and unoccupied areas that surrounded it. How could the nascent nation's federal democracy manage to stand above a landscape as expansive as this? There it stood, the crisp, sugar-like whiteness of Parliament House, alone in the paddock. Even the trail of 30,000 spectators who'd come to view the royal party open the Parliament appeared tiny from that hill. In an ominous sign of Canberra's future, the thing that did seem to make its visual presence felt that day were the 2,000 cars that filled the makeshift parking areas on and below the hill. Now, in the first decades of Canberra's existence, federal parliament would continually be accused of being isolated from the country's main centres of population. Now, you have to ask, of course, okay, which Australian capital, wherever it was situated, would not have been accused of being isolated from other centres of population? In The Lucky Country, published in '64, of course, Donald Horne argued that politicians and government officials were exiled in Canberra away from the people they govern. The city, Horne said, was little more than an administrative garrison beautified by parks and gardens. Its stark incompleteness an uncomfortable reminder of the nation's immaturity. A few years later, George Seddon agreed, arguing that Canberra's isolation was disabling. If a national referendum was held on the city's future, there's an idea, Seddon confidently predicted that it would be voted down as the nation's capital. Canberra, Seddon wrote, might well be the best new town in the world, but it's a lousy capital. When the decision was finally made to place the new Parliament House on Capitol Hill in '74, misgivings about the capital's isolation still ran deep. In 1976, Murdoch's Australian complained that far from unifying the Federation, Canberra actually contributed to its geographical fragmentation. Like Brasilia and Washington, said the Australian, this aseptic test tube city, alienated from working Australia, had cut the governing class off from the people and the country whose interests are supposed to provide their reason for existing. The roads run straight here. There's not a stray leaf left lying on the barbered lawns, and the paint's perfect. But where's the connection with real life? 1976. Understandably sensitive to that tide of criticism, the brief for the new Parliament House on Capitol Hill explicitly set out to put an end to the charges of a cloistered, isolated, un-Australian federal capital. the apex of Griffin's Triangle would now be crowned with a building that connected the Parliament with the nation it served. The brief imagined that the winning design would become, quote, a major symbol in the same way that the spires of Westminster or Washington's Capitol Dome have become to people all over the world. It would also, this is really crucial I think, it was also to pay close attention to the specifics of place, to climate, landscape, vegetation and the quality of light. This environmental sensibility was a way of ensuring that Canberra's, those accusations of being isolated and cloistered would come to an end. When the New York-based firm Mitchell, Thorpe and Jurgler's design was announced the winner, the assessors praised its faithfulness to Griffin's original vision because, they said, the winning design avoided the imposition of monumentality. It coexisted with the landscape rather than dominating the landscape. Labor Senator Gareth Evans, who wrote, I think, one of the most frequently quoted passages in the assessor's report, enthused that with this building, far from the new Parliament House glowering down, forbidding and inaccessible, people will walk and children will clamber and play over its roof. Evans' image of Australian children frolicking over their subterranean democracy would soon be scuttled by security concerns. Today, the lawns of Parliament House are cordoned off by a massive security fortification in the form of a 2.6 metre high steel security fence. Like Griffin's original plan for Canberra, Mitchell, Thorpe and Jurgler's design for Parliament House was framed by the firm's experience in the United States. As Jurgler explained after the building's completion, don't forget, we were in New York. When you mentioned Australia, people would say, where's that? We didn't know anything about Australia. Reading the brief was the first time we'd actually come into contact with the place. But we spent a tremendous amount of time trying to understand the place, sensing the place. Australia was different. We read Patrick White. You're laughing again. Okay. And we learned about Aboriginal people and all the other things that we didn't know anything about. As White wrote Voss reading Leichhardt's journals in the Victorian State Library without once setting foot in the interior, Jurgler's firm designed a new Parliament House for a country that they initially knew little about. 70 years earlier, as a schoolboy in Rome, Jurgler was taken by a poster on the wall of his classroom. It was Griffin's winning design for Canberra, in which he saw, quote, nature and architecture merge into one another. When he delivered the 1982 Walter Burley Griffin Lecture as a member of the winning design team, he spoke of his desire to make true places. Parliament House, he explained, would not be a wound on the landscape. It would draw on architectural history as a quiet teacher, an echo, or what he evocatively called a memory chord. In its attempt to express both the character of Australia's democracy and its people, the Parliament, he claimed, would become a kind of bridge between the order of the city and the order of the landform. It would actually confront the scale of the landscape and the scale of the city. The result would be a building that embodied, he said, a sense of fellowship and dignity among citizens, qualities he believed that were fundamental to any country's democratic life. The building's curved walls were a powerful example of what he was trying to achieve. Taking inspiration, partly from Thomas Jefferson's library in Virginia, he saw them as signalling an open, receptive gesture towards the city and the nation. And these architectural influences travelled in both directions. At the same time as his firm was working on designing Parliament House, it was also acting as a consultant to the architect working on the 75-year master plan for Capitol Hill in Washington. And Jurgler's experience in Canberra, as he explained, helped to shape that advice, which included maintaining the existing park between Washington's train station and the mall as a natural element of its urban landscape and creating, he hoped, that physically elusive yet precise sense of belonging which exists in Canberra. One of the most striking aspects of Mitchell, Thorpe and Jergler's approach to Parliament House was, I think, the firm's awareness of the particular historical moment they were inhabiting, both within Australia and internationally. Art historian Pamela Berg, who led the coordination of the building's art collection in the 1980s, later remarked that, coming from the USA gave the firm, a greater appreciation of the rare opportunity that they'd been given here to be involved in the design of one of only a handful of parliamentary buildings constructed in the 20th century, a building which they were instructed to design for a minimum lifespan of 200 years. As for the national context, Jergler was even more explicit. We were enormously facilitated, he said, by historical circumstances. Australians at this time seemed to be entering a moment in which they were very conscious of themselves. The symbolic element of the firm's design, with its stated ambition to express the spirit of Australian democracy, was an attempt to grapple with this moment of national self-consciousness and to literally create, as it were, a national architecture, or in the words of Frank Bongiorno, a renovated national identity, because, as it does, the boomerang-shaped building evokes Aboriginality and landscape. Now, among Jergler's chief advisors were Paul Keating and Manning Clark, both of whom maintained their friendship with him after the building was completed. From 1983, Clark was advising the firm on the historical documents and quotations that would hang inside the new Parliament House, and perhaps maybe on which Patrick White novel he should read next. When Clark accepted this consultancy, the letter of confirmation from the Parliament House Construction Authority left him in no doubt as to his task. He was instructed to, quote, provide us with phrases, sentences and mottos which will serve as a rallying point for this country. The new Parliament was clearly seen as an opportunity to provide a bank of stories, historical narratives that would provide positive national identification. Meanwhile, at the same time that Clark was developing a relationship with Treasurer Paul Keating, so too was Jergler. The two men met through Keating's role as a member of the committee overseeing the building's construction. As Jergler explained, one day I was in Sydney. I met Keating in the street near his home in Potts Point, and he took me around. We visited lots of houses. He was so passionate about architecture, and we talked a lot about Carl Friedrich Schinkel, the neoclassical German architect of the early to mid-19th century. As Jergler later told Clark in an interview recorded for the National Library, his discussions with Keating helped to inform his broader understanding of Australia. And that begs the question, well, what understanding of Australia did the firm get from Manning Clark and Paul Keating? When you read Manning Clark's advice on those historical quotations and documents, in tandem with interviews that Jergler gave, it's possible to see, I think, that this vision was essentially Republican. And it's one that was only just beginning to appreciate the centrality of Indigenous Australia to Australian culture, history and identity. From the outset, interestingly, Clark directed them away from using phrases such as federation under the Crown, which he said might be controversial or politically disturbing to a Labor government, towards phrases that reflected the values and ethics of British colonisation. His handwritten note introducing his selection of historical quotations explained they were chosen for their inspirational quality. I was looking for something similar, he said, to the quotations on the walls of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. His draft began with Galloway Yunupingu in 1980, explaining at a land rights forum how the ancestral spirits gave names to the land, and it was followed by others from Daniel Dennehy, Henry Lawson, Dame Mary Gilmore, Bernard O'Dowd, Dame Enid Lyons, Ben Chifley, Robert Menzies, Gough Whitlam. Remarkably, when he sent the first collection of quotations to the Construction Authority. They sent them back because there were too many from Menzies. Can you believe that? But Clarke was explicit about his themes: the attitude, he wrote, of Aboriginal people to the land, the views of Aboriginal people on government, the motives and hopes of the British in establishing settlement in Australia, and, he said, the challenge of marrying the rich heritage of the Aboriginal, European and Asian cultural legacies. Like Clarke, Jurgular articulated an idealised understanding of the Indigenous spiritual association with the land. It followed then that non-Indigenous Australians had to learn from that spiritual connection and recognise, he said, the importance of the land and its need for preservation. So Jurgular sees a connection between the rising awareness of Indigenous culture and history and rights and the growing environmental consciousness that was, of course, occurring in Australia at the time and many other countries. And all of these ideals were to be expressed in Parliament House, a building, I think, that we can now see as carrying the emerging aspirations of Australia in the late 20th century. Indigenous recognition, brackets, albeit of a distinctly ornamental variety, environmental awareness, and an Australian vision of independence informed by a multicultural heritage. And in many ways, this moment was the culmination of the National Capital Development Commission's dreams in the late 1950s of establishing Capitol Hill and the new Parliament House as the physical and spiritual centre of the nation. It's really difficult not to be struck by the self-consciousness of Canberra's creators, such as Jurgular and Clarke. Living here, it seems impossible to escape the task of nation building. There was Clarke sitting in his study in Tasmania Circle, writing 2 years after the building's completion and only a year before his death. From my study upstairs, I can look down over Lansdowne Plains, which the white man discovered way back in 1820. As you sit in the study, I can feel as though I belong to old Australia. But over the past 10 years, I've also been able to watch the construction of Parliament House from my study and watch the new Australia emerge. Now I can see the flagpole and I can get a sense of Parliament House growing out of the soil of Australia, representing the people and their inspiration. The people and their inspiration. These words appear almost quaint from our jaded perspective 30 years later. Mitchell, Thorpe and Jurgular hoped that the gigantic flag mast that Clarke could see from his study, one of the largest stainless steel constructions in the world, would become the permanent rallying point for the nation's citizens. But what has become of those democratic and national ideals that drove this city's and the Parliament's foundation in the 70s and 80s? And what of the politicians themselves, the majority of whom, of course, have come from other cities and towns to live and work in that new Parliament House? What is their experience of that? The man who turned the first sod of soil as construction of the new Parliament House began, former Liberal PM Malcolm Fraser, remarked in 1997 that approving construction of the building was a great mistake. A decade later, he described it as the most extravagant building ever built in Australia, one that divides politicians from the publics they're meant to serve. Prominent MPs from the Hawke-Keating era recoiled from what Neil Blewett called some of its more grandiose pretensions, and the eclectic confusion, he wrote, of its rag-bag neo-Art Deco style. Paul Keating's Boswell, Don Watson, memorably saw the new Parliament as interred in a vast lawn beneath a giant rattling aluminium hills hoist of a flagpole on a hill, an elephantine expression of the suburban dream. Walking down Parliament House's cavernous corridor between Aussie's Cafe and the Prime Minister's office, journalist James Button remembered Keating's lament about walking these floors and not feeling as if I was part of anything. For Barry Jones and many others who spent a decade in Old Parliament House before they moved to its successor, the distances in the new building inhibited personal interactions. They also go some way to explaining how the Prime Minister's office, which Button depicted as a bunker at the rear end of the building in which 50 people work, sometimes 2 or 3 to a tiny office with almost no natural light, that it could become so removed from other arms of government. Jones tried to explain in his autobiography that new Parliament House maximises the separation between the executive and the backbench, between the representatives and the senators, between the individual members and the centres for collective activity. The corridors, which in old Parliament House used to be full of activity, are now deserted. The building's enormous. The ground floors cover an area larger than Homer's Troy, wrote Jones. Similar complaints abound from former MPs and journalists. Like Laurie Oakes, Graham Freudenberg saw the whole building as a monument to executive power, while former Prime Minister Julia Gillard lamented the position of the Cabinet Room, which she described as a windowless, wood-panelled tomb isolated in the central spine of Parliament House across from the PM's office. A room that Liberal Senator Amanda Vanstone also found asphyxiating. Isolation without, isolation within. Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull has at least taken up residence in Canberra, unlike former PM John Howard, who chose to live in Kirribilli House in Sydney for the 11 years of his prime ministership. Yet Turnbull is also critical of the building, pointing out its absence of what he calls collision space for politicians of different political colours to bump into each other, which he says just increases the polarised political culture in which cross-party friendships are less common. Now, in many ways, these kinds of responses to the new building weren't surprising. 3 years before the building was even completed, Terry Futrell predicted that its construction would see the executive assume an entrenched position within its own enclave and that ministers would be physically more remote from backbenches. And for those who remembered working in old Parliament House, a building in which intermingling was so common, as John Edwards wrote in 1973, so common that journalists and politicians exchanged not only information, but accents, styles of speaking, styles of behaving, sexual partners and colds. The constant refrain was that this new building lacked physical intimacy. The word intimacy occurs over and over again, the absence of intimacy in this new building. The architecture of this new People's House curiously reproduced the boundless spaces that divided much of the city at Crown. Distance without, distance within. The distance of MPs from their electorates and from one another inside the building had become, some believed, enshrined as a civic reality. Canberra has no Macquarie Street or Spring Street on which citizens can walk by their parliament. Its circular mound of democracy is almost always assailed by car. More recently, criticisms of Parliament House and Canberra have reached an entirely different and more threatening level. As John Warhurst noted in 2014, they actually involve the potential dismantling of Canberra, and they raise the whole idea of what it means to be a national capital. As well, Warhurst wrote, as pointing to the profound weakness of the place of Canberra in the national psyche. Leading the way in that criticism is none other than former Prime Minister Paul Keating. Living in motels in Canberra, it's no fun, says Keating. Going to Chinese restaurants in Manuka, it's got its limitations. Canberra is of essence a great mistake. Keating proposes that we move federal parliament to Garden Island in Sydney. You don't need to think too hard about the sort of images that would soon be coming up in the press about an isolated parliament if it was on Garden Island. If Parliament sat in Sydney, Keating says, where one can conduct a proper life, MPs would have a better understanding of the problems being faced by their constituents. But what to do with an empty Parliament House? Keating has that problem solved as well. If the National Gallery wants room for more pictures, they've got one. Bob Carr's recently published diaries kept during his time as Foreign Minister echo Keating's hardline view. Parliament House doesn't work, writes Carr. Whoever put it together had no idea of the community or collegiality of a parliament. The spaces are grandiose, they're unfriendly. The very definition of misery for Carr is to enter its corridors on a Saturday or Sunday outside the dismal winds of a wintry Canberra. Kevin Rudd's impression was equally bleak. Arriving in Canberra as a newly elected MP in 1998 and lonely for his young family, Rudd felt that there was something deeply unwelcoming about the building. I realise it's heresy to say this, Rudd writes in the first volume of his autobiography, but I have never liked the new Parliament House. It's too monolithic, too cavernous, too cold for the Australian character. We're a friendlier people than that. Its seemingly infinite network of connecting hallways where most members spend most of their lives wandering in search of the next meeting has all the clinical charm of the blank, staring corridors of a Swiss sanatorium. As Prime Minister, Rudd escaped the sanatorium by introducing roving cabinet meetings that were held in various cities around the country. Similar views of Parliament House aren't actually hard to find. Only weeks ago, architect Penley Boyd claimed that the building had actually helped to create Canberra's inward-looking, emotionally isolated, self-centred political culture, and it should be abandoned. We should build a new parliament, Boyd argued, down on the shores of Lake Burley-Griffin. Now, despite this avalanche of criticism from many who've worked in the building, Parliament House's 30th anniversary in May demonstrated nonetheless that there's still considerable affection for the building as opposed to its residents. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that many of these critiques of Parliament House lapse into architectural determinism. In other words, they accord too much explanatory power to the design of the building when seeking to understand many of the rapid changes in Australia's political culture since the 1980s. Michelle Grattan has pointed out that for many commentators, this new Parliament House has become a metaphor for the changes in politics and society and the relationship between media and politicians, many of which are negative. As Grattan explained, everything seems to become bigger, faster, more distant. Now, the litany of those changes reflecting democracy's fall is familiar to all of you. A breakdown of trust between the electorate, politicians and the media, the increasingly curated nature of political speech and tightly controlled communication that results in a total absence of spontaneity, epidemic leadership instability and the concentration of executive power. Now, at various times, Parliament House has been blamed for all of these changes. Its huge, sprawling complex providing a home for an army of professional minders and lobbyists who are trained to limit and corral access to politicians, its isolated wings cultivating a culture of secrecy and factional islands which recklessly seek to destroy one another, and finally its design which entrenches an executive fenced off from the wider parliament, an island parliament for an island continent. While the design of Parliament House is entangled with many of these changes, we're mistaken, I think, if we place too much emphasis on the building itself and even Canberra as our federal capital for the ills of our federal political culture. The loss of intimacy and trust is explained even more powerfully by changes in technology, television, mobiles, social media, all of which paradoxically increase access and visibility at the same time as they feed mistrust and frame a more tightly managed politics, including those ubiquitous prime ministerial press announcements delivered in mock presidential style, backdropped by the Australian flag and the predictable, closely pressed clan of mute, nodding advisors. And while many within the Canberra Press Gallery complain of their more isolated position in the new parliament compared to the old, we should remember, as Karen Middleton found in 2009, that Canberra is unique in Westminster parliaments at least, with both the Cabinet and the Press Gallery, complete with television studios accommodated within the parliamentary building. As for the professional minders and lobbyists, they'd be with us today with or without the building, as would the ever-increasing lack of authenticity in political communication and the failure of political leadership. So rather than fall into the trap of thinking that a new parliamentary building or national capital will miraculously transform our ailing politics, we should look to our legislators and our own level of engagement where the true transformative potential resides. Remoteness and isolation are in any case part of the condition of living in this continent. In a federation that's so vastly spread and so recently created, Canberra has succeeded in binding us, I think, in ways that we still don't fully understand. Beating the Canberra drum, whether that's remembering Whitlam on the steps of Old Parliament House, Rudd's apology speech, a sea of hands on the lawn surrounding Parliament House, the passage of the same-sex marriage legislation, or even nostalgically reciting a Keating bon mot or an Abbott faux pas, become a means of talking this nation into being, or at least imagining it as one. To talk federal politics is to overcome the vast distances that separate Australians and provide the country with a narrative hearth. As Alan Atkinson has remarked, public events in Canberra entirely overshadow public events in the state capitals as a focus of interest for Australians. Canberra, as a stage for political dramas, Alan wrote, now has a powerful history of its own, a dramatic piece of narrative which means something to us all and which has an obvious setting, a geographical and architectural backdrop. While that much is certainly true, Canberra's capacity to become the spiritual centre of the Commonwealth remains partial at best. To explain why and to draw towards the conclusion, I want to take you back to the day that New Parliament House was opened in 1988 and the speeches that were then delivered by opposition leader John Howard and Prime Minister Bob Hawke. Howard spoke proudly of 200 years of tolerance and progress and of the genius of British parliamentary democracy. He praised Queen Elizabeth as the pinnacle of our democratic system of government. Although he was speaking at the opening of the new Parliament, Howard looked to the War Memorial, where he said the blood and sacrifice of those that have kept this country free was exalted. Hawke's speech couldn't have been more different. He reflected on the ghosts or spirits of the past. At the most remote level, he said, we're reminded by the historians and archaeologists that the Canberra region has nurtured human habitation for at least 21,000 years. The Aboriginal civilisation and culture that developed from those earliest times was so quickly disrupted after the arrival of Europeans that we don't know with precision what they meant by the word Canberra. Certainly, one version, Hawke said, is that it meant a meeting place. The meeting place to which Hawke alluded, the depth of Indigenous occupation of Canberra and the continent, and the invitation to enter the new Parliament was now symbolised by Papunya artist Michael Giacomo Nelson's 196 square metre forecourt mosaic, Possum and Wallaby Dreaming. In the remarks of Howard and Hawke that day, we can recognise, I think, the contours of many of the competing foundational historical narratives that would become a persistent feature of our politics and culture in the late 20th century and the early 21st century, and perhaps many of which still pervade the politics of Indigenous recognition today. At the time Hawke and Howard spoke in front of the Queen, Aboriginal protesters plastered the wall, the western wall of the forecourt, with land rights flags, while 1,500 gathered to protest at the opening ceremony, many of them booing, hissing and chanting loudly in an attempt to drown out the official speeches. Kevin Gilbert reminded MPs that until justice was met with a treaty, Australia could not achieve its full potential and integrity as a nation. Inside the new chamber, Michael Giacomo Nelson was presented to the Queen. 5 years later, dismayed with a lack of progress over native title, Nelson symbolically removed a piece of that very mosaic as he stood in front of a crowd of over 1,000 demonstrators and claimed that the Australian Parliament had actually appropriated his painting for its own aggrandisement. The Government of Australia, he told his supporters, are still failing to recognise our people and our culture. It's abusing my painting and it's insulting my people. I want to take my painting back to my people. 30 years on, our federal parliament still struggles to move beyond ornamental recognition of Indigenous Australians. It's failed to live up to the promise of the story threaded through every piece of Nelson's forecourt mosaic. The walls of our parliament are graced by petitions and demands from Indigenous Australians, their potential unmet, unrealised. Yet the history of this parliament can't be written without addressing that history and, of course, the history of the tent embassy in the same breath. Nowhere in the parliamentary triangle, aside from the easily missed interpretive panels in Reconciliation Place and the uninvited tent embassy, is there any Indigenous presence. No National Museum of Indigenous Australia, as Kevin Rudd had hoped to build adjacent to Questacon and Reconciliation Place, a site which is incidentally earmarked as being reserved for a significant national building and/or a significant national place of special status and interest. No national resting place for Indigenous remains. No memorial acknowledging the truth of the country's brutal foundation. No recognition, spiritual, constitutional or material. That absence is telling because I think it speaks of the silence that still lies at the heart of the Commonwealth's foundation. In a mere century, the construction of the capital has in many ways obliterated traditional ways of understanding country. The country around Parliament House, once lightly timbered, is now largely treeless, defined by geometric lines and monolithic avenues that carve their way through the land below. Capitol Hill was, of course, once named Kurrajong Hill, after a lone tree that stood there until it was removed in 1928. And it was, as Ngunnawal elders Ruth and Don Bell have told us, part of an ancient pathway between Black Mountain and Tuggeranong. A site of special significance, it was used for ceremonial purposes and as a regular camping ground and meeting place. If you compare this knowledge to the history of the workers' camps and hostels that occupied Capitol Hill for a few decades in the 20th century during the capital's construction, those Indigenous uses of land now occupied by federal parliament are largely lost to public memory and to the parliament itself. The ignorance of this knowledge seems entirely consistent, I think, with the absence of recognition of Indigenous Australians within that triangle and within the Constitution. If the city and its parliament is to fulfil the ambitions of its founders, which I was actually quite struck by when I went back working on this lecture, the idealism of that period of the late 50s, early 60s, and right through to the building of New Parliament House, the idealism and ambitions, if they are to be realised, then Canberra is to become, and its parliament is to become, the physical and spiritual centre of the Commonwealth, then Canberra must become the site of the Commonwealth's refounding. And that, I think, is the true emptiness at Canberra's heart. Of course, in all of this, there is this city and its parliament as they were imagined, designed and intended to be, and there's the city and its parliament as they're created over time, a transitional, vacillating experiment, as the disappointed but nonetheless sanguine Walter Burley Griffin memorably described Canberra in 1922. Like Washington, Delhi, Brasilia, this city can no longer be explained or understood solely through the intentions of its founders. It's become something else again, shaped and designed as much, if not by more by its lived experience. And that is the real substance of Canberra's and the Parliament's ongoing creation. There's no going back, not to Garden Island or anywhere. As for Canberra's generosity of space, it should be celebrated. As the architect Philip Cox remarked on the occasion of the city's centenary, Canberra is the grandest urban landscape of the 20th century. It has no comparison, it has no peer. It has an Australian distinction of endless space. It's truly an expression of our democracy and our Australian way of living. Endless space, a capital unfinished, an enviable freedom. The spiritual centre of the Commonwealth remains ours to shape. Thank you.